Thank you very much, Jean. That was a lovely introduction. I must say it's a great honour to be here, and also somewhat daunting. So please be patient with me. I'd first of all like to say thank you for being invited, particularly to Jean, but also the Wildlands Conservation Trust, who funded my attendance. And I hope I'm going to put a few ideas out there that might be new to you and to get us all thinking a little bit about marine conservation. It's actually been very interesting for me bringing this talk together because it's sort of helped me focus some of the research that I've been doing and some of the conservation practice I've been doing. So I hope you will find it interesting. The first thing I want to say is that fish are wildlife. And certainly in a conservation context, I like to point that out. They're exploited. It's generally accepted that they're exploited, but they are actually wildlife. So for those of you who work more in the terrestrial environment, that's not always the case. So it gives us, I guess, an extra challenge in terms of conservation. It means that we really do have to make co-management work. We really do have to make conservation have benefits for the fishers who are fishing those fish. What I'm going to do through this talk is I'm going to describe the fisheries I'm talking about, the artisanal fisheries. They're fairly complex, so I want to give you a bit of a brief background, particularly for those who are not so familiar with them. And then I'm going to go through some of the conservation concerns that we have in those fisheries. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on data and monitoring because that's what we really need in order to assess populations. I'm going to talk a little bit about species-specific vulnerabilities. This is a key issue. And I'm going to briefly mention climate change because it's such a huge issue, but I don't really have time to cover that, and also destructive fishing gears. And then move on and sort of pulling this together in terms of what are our management opportunities. And I'm going to particularly focus on marine protected areas, throw out an idea on payment for ecosystem services, and see if I get shot down on that one, and talk a little bit about resilience to climate change. So I said they're complex. In East Africa, our coastal population is over 20 million at the moment, and it's growing rapidly, so we're expecting it to reach about 39 by 2014. And many of these people are highly dependent. So in Kenya, for example, the highest poverty rates are on the coast. These are the fishing communities. So this really does lead to issues of overfishing, and also with that comes destructive and illegal fishing. We have to remember the food security issues, and this is raising its head enormously. I'm sure you're hearing about that globally. So you can't just say you've got to stop fishing because you're overfishing. And fortunately, we do have co-management structures in place. Legislation was passed in 2007. We've got beach management units, which is a great step forward. They're in Kenya, they're in Tanzania, and Mozambique. We have CCPs, which is a terrific starting point because there hasn't been a history of co-management. Just to give you just a few pictures of the sorts of fisheries I'm talking about. Why are they complicated? Because they're multi-gear. So in Kenya, we've documented over 14 different artisanal gears, and I've got a little booklet on that if anybody's interested. So they range from very low technology traditional dugout canoes using fibre traps to more commercial with using an outboard, large crews, purse seine nets, etc. So a wide range of gears brought in at a wide range of landing sites, huge numbers of different species. Just in the coral reef fisheries, which is what I'm going to focus on in this talk because that's the area that I really work in, and unashamedly a few grouper examples in there because I'm a bit partial to them. But coral reef fisheries, over 163 species have been documented. So they're complicated. It's not like some of the commercial fisheries where you're just focusing on one. So, turning to the first point that I really want to talk about is the data. We need the data. We need to be monitoring these fisheries in order to assess the state of them from a fishery point of view, but also from a population status point of view. So how good are the data? Well, usually national statistics in our region are not very good. So they're the statistics that get reported to FAO. So that's worth thinking about when you think about FAO statistics. There's usually little or no historic data, which is really problematic in in terms of looking at trends, and they're usually highly aggregated. So, for example, the statistics that are given to FAO from Kenya just talk about demersal fishes, which really doesn't help us at all. Grouper are very rarely reported separately. Catch per unit effort is the standard that we tend to use in monitoring trends in fisheries, okay? But usually the effort part's forgotten. So that index becomes useless. If you've just got catch and you don't know the effort, it's not really much good. So I throw that out as an example, and I give you some FAO statistics from the Western Indian Ocean. These are all FAO except for the red ones, the Maldives, which I superimpose. This is just grouper catches that are reported back to FAO. It's catch, okay? No effort. So you don't really know when you're looking at the trends, why has it suddenly stopped? Why is the grouper fishery in Tanzania, why did it stop in 2005? It doesn't seem to coincide with any management. If anything, that's when an export fishery started in grouper. But as you can see, there's fairly significant grouper fisheries in the region. Nothing for Kenya, but we know grouper are taken in Kenya. It's just an illustration of data and fisheries data. It's always problematic. I'm going to go now to a more detailed study that we've been doing in Kenya, pulling together data for the last sort of 20-odd years, looking at published reports, papers, etc., asking that question, how good is this data and what's it telling us about the state of the artisanal fisheries? So we just focused on coral reef fisheries, and I'm going to show you some of the results and hopefully illustrate some of the dangers of aggregating data, which is inevitably what happens with these very complicated fisheries because there are so many gears and so many species. And the first thing I want to point out is the capture rate of juveniles, which is alarmingly high. So this is what proportion of the catch is catching juveniles, i.e. fish that are under minimum size at first reproduction. And any of you who are fisheries people will know that that's a real no-no. We don't have any size limits in these fisheries, which I don't think is necessarily a problem in the sense that it's very difficult to have size limits in these sorts of artisanal fisheries, very difficult to enforce. But I had no idea it was quite so high, 50% across all gears. If you look at the two gears, I just want to point out the beach seine and the spear gun are illegal. Okay, so they've been illegal since 2001, and the beach seine has got the highest. 68% of the catch comprises juvenile fish, but the spear gun is 38%. The spear gun's actually the lowest. And there's a lot of evidence in our analysis that suggests that spear guns shouldn't be illegal. I'm not really sure why they were made illegal. Looking at the CPUE data, all we could pull together was data from the mid-80s, one data point, and then from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. And what it shows is that there's been a fourfold decline from the mid-80s to the 90s, but as I say, only one study in the mid-80s, so huge gaps in the data to really know what was going on. And what was it like in the 70s and the 60s? We just don't know. So it's dropped from about 14 kg per fisher per trip to about 3. But the CPUE's been fairly constant in that last sort of decade from the mid-90s, and generally a constant CPUE is a good sign. It suggests it's sustainable, it's maintaining it, so it's, you know, perhaps encouraging. And there's some interesting patterns there, differences between the gears that are consistent, etc. But I was a little bit concerned about this, so I said let's bore down a bit more and look at what's the species composition in these gears. So that was aggregated CPUE. So here we're looking at the 5 gears out of the 14 that we've really got any data on. And what surprised me when we started looking at the species composition per gear was that it was only very few species that actually that you saw in each of the different gears. The only gear that had a fairly different range of species was the hand line, which has a lot of lathrinids, emperors and snappers. But the others have got very similar cross-section of species, and there are 2 species, let's see if I can get this to work, that crop up all the time. Syganus suter and Leptoscarus vigensis, where is it? There. Okay, so that's a rabbitfish, and that's the seagrass parrotfish. And this surprised me that it was even in gill nets you're getting Siganus suter, whereas I always thought it was a basket trap species. So this is just to illustrate that you're actually getting the same species. And we tend to think in artisanal fisheries, there's hundreds of species, so the fishing effort is spread, so the risk is spread. But actually, the effort's concentrated on just a few, except in the handline. The handline's somewhat different. And those two species I just mentioned comprise a very high percentage across all gears. So over 40% of the catch on each one, which is very high pressure just on a couple of species. Looked at this a little bit more and looked at it over time, and what we find is that that species composition has declined. So here it is for basket traps in 1999. Look at it in 2007. Certain species have dropped out altogether, and now we're just fishing Siganus suter and Lathrinus marcena. And a similar pattern seen in two of the other gears. Sorry, what was that last one? Yeah, same one. Okay. So that's the basket traps. And the gill net, again, a decline in the number of species. So this is the top 65% of species by number. It's very hard to get weight. And as you can see, a drop, and also in the beach seine. So I guess what this led us to concern, really, was that we're seeing a complete disappearance of species, and then this increasing fishing pressure on two species. So we're asking the question, are we reaching a limit? A popular expression, a tipping point, that one reads in the literature. And I'm just saying that we certainly don't want to reach this. This is Tanga, Tanzania, different reasons going on here. This is some underwater visual census data on carnivore densities, which crashed in 2003. And the big question when you're looking at CPUE, you're coming along here, when are you going to reach this point? What are the indicators to tell us when we're reaching that crashing point or tipping point? So on the basis of this work, we wrote a policy brief for the Kenyan government, for the Ministry of Fisheries, with some recommendations. And I'll refer to them towards the end when I sort of pull things together. I have to mention climate change because it's such a big issue on coral reefs. And I don't think I'll say anything here that you don't know, but particularly for those of you perhaps who don't know coral reefs or work in the terrestrial environment, corals are a bit like the canary in the coal mine for global warming. So sea surface temperature rise makes coral bleach, then they die, and you get a collapse, and so you can get a complete sort of phase shift, an ecosystem phase shift, where it goes from coral-dominated to brown algae-dominated. And what I wanted to point out here was that there's been a lot of work done now on herbivores grazing coral reefs and helping to keep them more resilient, more resistant, and more able to recover. And the parrotfish, play a very key role in that. And this is an interesting thing to talk to fishermen about, that, you've got to look after your parrots. So they basically keep the algae down and help the coral regrow. Another group that I found interesting is that a really nice study done by Nick Graham and co-workers looking at long-term data around the Western Indian Ocean on the effects of bleaching. And he found that the lathrinids, the emperors, are the least affected. Although those of you who know the lathrinids, it's a huge family ranging over a whole wide range of different habitats. So I'm suggesting that it's really worth thinking about them as fisheries of the future under climate change. And interestingly, they're the ones taken by the handlines in that previous graph, which are it's a different gear with a different suite of species. So something to think about in terms of managing that particular gear. And briefly, I have to mention the dynamite fishing, which is a horrendous... I don't even like to call it a fishing gear. It's not really. So it's chucking out homemade bombs to catch fish. It's rampant in Tanzania. There was a big program in Tanga that really did remarkable work to stop it in the sort of late 90s. The Tanga Coastal Zone project was funded by Irish Aid and implemented with the help of IUCN. But when that project wound down, it just came back with a vengeance, and it's now all down the mainland coast. I mean, it's really completely out of control. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is this going on? And I liken dynamite fishing to organised crime. It's really a mafia. And I think, you know, as a fish ecologist, I don't have the tools for dealing with something like that. And then beach seining gives you another example of a destructive gear in Kenya that, although it's illegal, it's still very widespread in certain areas. And when you talk to fishermen, why do they allow it? Again, it's organised by a rich man, a tajiri, who brings in his crew. And he's paying the BMUs a levy, fishing levy. And they say, we can send our kids to school now. So, you know, of course we're going to allow it. These are difficult things to deal with. Okay, I'm going to move on now to life history vulnerabilities, which I think is I guess this is sort of one of my areas of academic interest, looking at life history vulnerabilities in groupers. And I put up just some key species here that we have in the coral reef fisheries of our region of Eastern Africa. Calinus undulatus, the Maori wrasse or Napoleon wrasse, which is listed as endangered. It's also listed on CITES Appendix 2 because there's a huge trade in it in Southeast Asia for the live fish trade in Hong Kong and China. And there's substantial IUU fishing on this in Southeast Asia and also the Pacific. Interestingly, it's not highly targeted in our region, and in the Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean, we've got reasonably healthy populations. So they have global significance. How you talk about global significance at the local community level is a little tricky. And then just a couple of grouper, Plectropomus laevis is listed as vulnerable, and then Bulbometapon muricatum, the largest parrotfish, the humphead parrotfish, is also listed as vulnerable. And we see very few of these in East Africa. And one of the things I've talked to fishermen about this species is that this plays a key role in keeping reefs healthy and clean and more able to be resilient in the face of climate change. And that gives you an avenue in, if you like, for protecting a species that's got global significance. So the key biological parameters that we really need to know for our target species, and this is not rocket science, just age, growth and reproduction, but in East Africa there's no fish aging work done at all. There's no technology for it, and there's very minimal reproductive biology. So I'm talking primarily about Kenya and Tanzania here. And I'd like to put in a plea here that there really is potential for collaboration with scientists in South Africa. And those of you who know me know that I've been saying this. There's lots of expertise here, particularly in Grahamstown. And this is not difficult work, but it's fundamental. We've got to know how old the fish are, we've got to know how long they live, we've got to know when they start reproducing. And I just want to point out a paper that's coming out this year from the IUCN Grouper Specialist Group, Fishing Groupers Towards Extinction. And I thought I'd better put in a South African fishery here, which is the South African commercial hook and line fishery. It takes actually a number of species, but it does take groupers. And Sean Fennessy has contributed great data on groupers for the specialist group. And I just mentioned there sharks. I'm not going to talk about them. Huge issue. We've got virtually no sharks. And then rabbitfish. What do we know about their life history? I've been talking about rabbitfish. But I'm going to move on just quickly to the marble grouper, Epinephalus fusco-guttatus, which is Indo-Pacific. It's very wide-ranging. And these lovely graphs, I'm afraid, don't come from East Africa. They come from the Great Barrier Reef. Very elegant study. But it's, I think, a beautiful illustration of a fish that has vulnerable life histories in terms of fisheries and fishing them. So it's a hermaphrodite, which is very common in a lot of groupers. So they're female first. And you'll notice the females don't start reproductive activity until they're about 9 years old. Okay, so it's a long time. They start at about 9. They're very active between 10 and 15, if you look at the graph here. And then the other significant thing is that they go on being reproductively active for about 30 years. So, yeah, I know, it's amazing, isn't it? And they also form spawning aggregations, which is something I've worked on, and I'll talk about spawning aggregations in a minute. So from a fisheries point of view, this is quite challenging. And it brings in the question of minimum size limits, so that they do reproduce, and maybe maximum size limits, so that you do protect some of the big, fecund females. We've worked on them in Kenya at a spawning aggregation. So it's, you know, can we do that? Can we bring in size limits in an artisanal fishery like this? I think it's very difficult. Can we do it through gear restrictions, perhaps? How would we implement it? This is the sort of thing that I've been talking with fishers through these beach management units. And you can see just a couple of pictures here, teaching them to measure the size of fishes as they come in, and then saying, okay, we know from the literature what's the minimum size limit. The minimum first size at first reproduction, and you know the lights go on. They get it. They really get it. So I think we try and work out how to do this with fishers. They can think about some of the solutions. It's not for us to think about all the solutions. So we did, I'm going to talk now about a study we did over a couple of years looking at spawning aggregations in rabbitfish. As I've mentioned, rabbitfish a few times, a key target species in these gears, in the East African gears. And we used a variety of different methods to get a handle on this phenomenon: acoustic tagging, underwater visual sensors. We did interviews with fishers on their knowledge of these aggregations, and we monitored the fishery. This is all on the south coast of Kenya. And what we found was that the fishermen report very specific months when these aggregations occur: November, December, January, February. The acoustic tagging showed that fish were coming back to these 3 sites that we'd been led to by fishermen, and they're coming back primarily over the full moon. The full moon came up in the underwater visual sensor surveys, which is when we saw higher numbers of fish. So none of the methods on their own were conclusive, but if you pull it all together, we found very strong evidence for fishermen targeting these very seasonal, specific spawning aggregations of Sygaena suta, the rabbitfish. As I said, they comprise a high proportion of the catch. In this particular area, it's 38%. We tried to work out what proportion of the catch fishermen are getting off these aggregations. So it's roughly a sort of 3-month fishery when they go to these offshore sites. Otherwise, they fish them along the nearshore in the seagrass beds. Okay, and through this worked out roughly what that catch might be worth. As you can say, there's rather large range. It depends a little bit on the numbers of fishers. Okay, so it was difficult to measure it accurately. We're talking about 93 fishers fishing these particular aggregations. We've then fed this information back to fishermen, talked to them about it, and they are now discussing, and I got this literally last week, they're now discussing protecting one of the sites. So they've been talking about protecting all 3, and then they decided, no, I think that's too difficult for us. Let's do one. And they selected one called Arusha because it's so far away. They chose that one because it's the least fish, plus it's got the highest coral cover, which I thought was interesting. They said, yeah, we might be able to get the tourists to come diving there. So, you know, they're thinking about how to have benefits out of these community conservation areas. That's what that acronym is. I haven't discussed the opportunity costs with them about this, that, you know, they might be losing that kind of money, because it's a tricky issue. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, moving now on to management opportunities. I've given you some of the concerns, I've described some of the fisheries, some of the research we've been doing, and sort of pulling it together. I think that protected areas are a key approach and a key strategy, and that's not new. What I want to point out is that the Kenyan government parks are a really good success story, and I'm not going to present the data. Tim McClanahan has done a lot of work on that with co-authors. I've pointed out one particular paper that's a nice one, Towards Pristine Biomass. And Mafia Marine Park in Tanzania, I'd say, is the only government marine park that's working. So there are some success stories with the government approach. We've got private parks like Chumbe Island in Zanzibar, Kuza Island in Seychelles, which are also working. Okay? So it's a combination of community benefits, enforcement, etc. The next approach that I want to talk about are these community conservation areas. So these are really implemented by local fishing communities. They're also called locally managed marine areas. And I think they've got great potential for example, for rabbitfish and marble grouper spawning sites. And then the other thing I want to talk about just briefly, I think I've got about 5 minutes, are payments, compensation, which is always a sort of controversial issue to talk about in conservation. But there are opportunity costs to these fishers. Going back to what I said in the beginning, we're talking about food security, livelihoods. You know, some of the poorest of the poor are the people who are fishing these fish. So there really are opportunity costs when you start declaring no-take zones. Community conservation areas, I really want to highlight an amazing project in Tanga, northern Tanzania, that was initiated by local government officers going to IUCN saying we've got a problem in the mid-90s. So he had the foresight, Solomon Makoloweka. And on the strength of that, this big IUCN Irish Aid-funded project started, Tanga Coastal Zone Project. It was the one that stopped the dynamite fishing. But the key thing, really, was that they declared 6 community conservation areas stretching over 1,600 square kilometres. They established no-take zones within them. They established co-management structures. It was really a remarkable project. And I think that a lot of people in our region have sort of forgotten about it because of the dynamite fishing. So they just think the whole thing was useless. But actually, the structures are there, and the awareness and the understanding is there, and we need to build on that. Now, Ali Kaka, who some of you would have heard on day one here, had the initiative to take fishers from Kuruwitu in Kenya to Tanga to look at it. And on the strength of that, they set up their community conservation area in Kuruwitu on the north coast of Kenya in 2006. And that has spawned all these others. They've just taken off like that, which is amazing. It's very encouraging. It's actually what happened in the Philippines when Gary Russ started doing this in the 80s and 90s with Angel Alcala. So I think this is extremely encouraging, and it is a real opportunity for co-management, but also for the concept of no-take zones. I think it's absolutely essential that we have fully protected areas within the whole ecosystem for these sorts of fisheries and managing these populations. Okay, so I'm now going to just put out there for you to think about, and I'd really like some feedback on this. So I'm sort of sticking my neck out. But payment for ecosystem services is an approach that's been used on land. I think it's been used in forests. It's got lots of potential, I think, and it brings up the issue of compensation. So I did this sort of back-of-the-envelope study in Mnazi Bay. Mnazi Bay Ruvuma Estuary is a huge marine park on the southern Tanzanian border with Mozambique. It's about 400 square kilometres. It's vast. And I looked at just the bay area, which is the coral reef area, and so it's hypothetical. Okay, so it's based on a lot of data that was available, and set it up that it would require adherence to no-take zones and gear restrictions. There are 3 illegal gears going on in Mnazi Bay Marine Park, including dynamite fishing. So it's dynamite fishing, beach seining, and mosquito nets. Okay, so they've got to totally stop doing that, and in exchange they will be compensated in cash. So these are the figures I did that I worked out. So here are the 2 no-take zones, and they're based on a very extensive mapping exercise that was done with all the villages in that area. Okay, by this GEF-funded project in the mid-2000s. And it's working with 4 seaside villages with more than 50% dependency on fishing, about 900 fishers. And what I did was worked with figures that are available from the literature, fish population recovery rates, I work with two key taxa, the rabbitfish, which you keep hearing about, and then the snappers and emperors, which they tend to report together, unfortunately. But anyway, it's one name, changu. Worked with spillover rates from studies done in Kenya, and then worked out population increases within these no-take zones, population increases due to spillover in the whole Bay Area, which was 260 square kilometers, I think. And through that, based on the value of fish, worked out the value of the spillover in dollars, okay, on these two taxa, and then the loss to the fishermen in terms of dollars because they're not allowed to fish in those no-take zones. And then, so that gave me the compensation value, and I did it for 5 years. And it's really important to stress that in these systems, they take 15 to 20 years to recover. This has to be a long-term initiative, okay? But I just modeled it for 5 years, okay? And those are the figures in bold to look at. So the compensation to fishers is worth about $145,000, but the potential benefit to fishers due to the spillover is $812,000. So I maintain it's worth doing that, and in 5 years' time they're going to say, these are great, this is really worth doing, look how our fisheries improved. So if we believe in no-take zones as ecologists, we need to put our money on the table. That's what I feel. Okay, so in summary, I think that hopefully what I've been able to show to you today is that we need all sorts of marine protected areas, MPAs. We need government ones, we need community ones, we need private ones. But within them, we need to have no-take zones. I think they're absolutely crucial. There's been a huge amount of work done on them, particularly in the Pacific, less so in our region, that they are crucial. And sort of the magic figure is 30% should be closed. But I think it's a vital strategy, particularly for spawning aggregations, for large fecund females, for protecting parrotfish, for looking after biodiversity, etc. They must have community benefits. That's usually the problem, that they don't, particularly in the old days. The government parks didn't. I think we do need to look at financing and compensation, and, you know, a PES-type approach, okay? This is somewhat new in an artisanal fisheries context. We tend to manage by gears only and say, oh, it's just taking a whole lot of species. I think we do need to do some species-specific management, and these two species, I think, are of particular concern in East Africa. They're highly targeted. And I think pulling all this together, you can call it, if you like, resilience-based fisheries management. We need to build the social resilience in the people dependent on these fisheries, and we need to build the ecological resilience. Okay, so we need those co-management structures, whether we've got BMUs or CCP in Mozambique. They need to be formal, but they need to be active. And one of the real constraints is that the fishermen do not... Has it gone? Oh, no, there it is. They don't yet have the information and the knowledge to come to the decision-making table, the management table, as equal partners. This is a real constraint. And finally, I think that in terms of resilience, I'd like to put out a campaign for emperors and parrots. I think that the Lithrinids, the emperors, have really got potential for the future under a climate change scenario, and we need to be looking after the parrotfish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melita. I must say, listening online, yes, listening to you take us through that kaleidoscope of systems and information, although it's incredibly sobering. One of the things that I think that is occurring to me more and more is particularly seeing we're here in South Africa, and I think we were talking about this, we keep thinking maybe here we've got different systems, we've got certain capacity to deal with them. But I think one of the lessons for us is we need to get on board with the bigger picture with East Africa in terms of contributing our data and our systems into the analyses and the deliberations so that we can be part of some of these solutions that you're putting forward. And then secondly, the very importantly for me, the ecosystem payment for ecosystem services. It's really a pity you weren't with us the last couple of days because there was such a lot of deliberation on services. And I think this is a new concept for us in the marine environment, the payment side of it, so it's awesome. We started a little bit late. I can give, so we're just going to run 5 minutes late into tea. So we could just take 2 short questions.
Melita, probably a fairly obvious one, but with regard to the payment for ecosystem services option, would those fishers who are now being financially compensated for stopping their fishing in the no-take zones be prevented from shifting their effort to adjacent areas? In other words, would they withdraw from the fishery altogether, or are you just going to have a shift of effort?
Yeah, I think the effort, they would still be fishing in that bay. So, if you like, there's more pressure in the bay outside the no-take zones, but they're not likely to shift altogether. I think one of the things that I haven't talked about is the need to actually reduce effort completely, because in all these fisheries, not quite all, actually, some of the offshore fisheries no, but we've basically got too much effort. And that is really challenging. And that's where compensation is another question. So there's a lot of debate about alternative livelihoods. There's not a lot of successes. And it's a short expression, but a very difficult thing to do. And we do need to decrease effort. And how do you do that when that's their food? It's very difficult.
Thanks, Gina. Just again about payment for ecosystem services. We also at the moment, at the municipality where I work in Durban, going along those lines. But I think it sounds a little bit negative, payment for ecosystem services. I think to put a more positive spin on it, like calling it investment in ecosystem services, would sell it more widely and would, I think, be the way to go. Just a comment.
Okay, yeah, I like that. I have to say, that study I put up is hypothetical. Okay, it's not being done. I just put it out there as a suggestion because, as Jean said, in the marine environment, we're not thinking about it an awful lot. Although it's starting. It's starting more in mangroves, and then there's blue carbon, and there are parallels there, if you like. I mean, there's a community in Kenya that is being paid to look after its mangroves. So, there's a parallel there. This is more in a compensation sort of context, and I think that in fisheries, in commercial fisheries, compensation is standard. In industrial developed countries, want to move people out of a fishery, you've got to compensate them. So why aren't we thinking about it in community fisheries?